USDA logo. United States Department of Agriculture. Meet the expert, Vijay Juneja, PhD.
I'm Vijay Juneja, and my role is to protect public health by conducting applied research with pathogenic microorganisms to ensure the safety of our food supply. And of course, my commitment is to serve American people by ensuring that the processed food is safe for human consumption, and at the same time, it gives homemade appeal to consumers when it comes on the dining tables, because we certainly want the processed food as if it was cooked by your moms at home.
Describe a brief synopsis of your research.
I work in food safety microbiology and develop series of predictive models for foodborne pathogens. These models are incorporated on the USDA pathogen modeling program, and they are extensively used all over the world by regulatory agencies as well as by the food industry to determine compliance with the regulatory performance standards, as well as to predict or estimate the behavior of the pathogens in food.
How does your research address the needs of the food industry?
We maintain a very close dialogue with the regulatory agencies to discuss technical matters and emerging issues, as well as to understand and define specific problems as well as high priority research needs. So my research addresses high priority research needs, critical food safety issues, challenges and concerns of the food industry as well as the regulatory agencies.
Describe the relevance of this research to food safety regulatory standards.
What I do is very critical to the development of effective foods policies so as to protect public health. And these models which I developed are extensively used to determine compliance with regulatory performance standards, as well as the research and the models I developed serve as a scientific basis for USDA and FDA regulations, and also they are routinely used by the regulatory agencies to determine the fate of the pathogens in case of cooling deviations, which routinely occurs in the food industry due to refrigeration system failure, and of course with the disposition of the products that are subject to cooling deviations.
Describe the type of equipment used in your laboratory.
So we have programmable water baths in our lab as well as an anaerobic chamber, and the programmable water bath is used to simulate the conditions that occur in the retail food environment when the food is cooked at a low temperature long time. So we can program the water baths to increase the temperature of the food from the room temperature to the final cooking temperature, which is 60 or 65 or 70 degrees centigrade at a certain rate. And likewise, certain pathogens that are not destroyed during the low temperature long time cooking of the food can grow, germinate and multiply during the cooling of the food if the rate and extent of cooling of the food is not adequate. So we can program the water bath to cool the food at a certain rate.
What are the additional outcomes of your research?
We develop series of predictive models, and these models are made available on our pathogen modeling program as well, and are extensively used by the food industry, and they save the large manufacturers $1 to $2 million per year. The industry as well as small and very small processors use the models to determine compliance with regulatory performance standards, and the regulatory agencies like FSIS and FDA use these models routinely to evaluate the safety of the foods during cooling, and of course with the disposition of the product subject to cooling deviations. And the research and the models we develop certainly serve as a scientific basis for USDA regulations, and the research also addresses the data gaps that are identified in microbial risk assessment. So they are used by risk assessors and the food safety managers to determine the impact of food processing and handling conditions on the probability of foodborne illness.
Were there any important findings from your research?
We clearly found in our research that the pathogens in the food or the deadly bacteria in the food can be rendered more sensitive to the lethal effect of heat by manipulating the food formulation factors, for example, by adding some natural antimicrobials or by reducing the pH or by adding salt levels. So we assess the effects and interactions of all these multiple food formulation factors so as to render the pathogens more sensitive to the lethal effect of heat, so that reduced extent of heat is required to destroy the pathogens in the food, and at the same time low intensity of the heat would retain the organoleptic attributes of the food, because we certainly want the processed food that goes to the dining tables gives a homemade appeal to the consumers, and the texture of the food is retained, the color of the food is retained, and so we optimize the cooking time and temperature so as to retain the natural attributes of the food products, so that the cooking temperature does not have a negative impact on the product quality, and at the same time we certainly want the processed food to be microbiologically safe.
What are the next steps for your research?
Sufficient evidence exists that the prior history of the pathogens have an influence on the time and temperature that would be required for the destruction of the pathogens in processed food. So we would certainly like to expose the pathogens in a different environment, such as acidic environment, or the pathogens in the food industry are sometimes exposed to sanitizers and then they contaminate the food before the food is cooked. So we would like to assess the effect of all these prior environmental conditions on the time and temperature that is required to destroy the pathogen in the food, because there is certainly sufficient evidence exists to document that the sublethal environment or the stressful environment of the food, of the pathogens in which they are exposed to, makes them more hardy, more resistant to the subsequent intervention treatment that is aimed to destroy the pathogens in the food.
USDA is an equal opportunity provider and employer. To file a complaint of discrimination, write to USDA, Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, Office of the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, 1400 Independence Avenue, Southwest. Stop 9410. Washington, D.C. 20250. Or call toll-free at 866-632-9992 for English, or 800-877-8339 for TDD, or 866-377-8642 for English Federal Relay, or 800-845-6136 for Spanish Federal Relay. Music by Dexter Britton. Available under Creative Commons license from www.dexterbritton.com.